I started out from an assumption that's long been in play in the Pacific Northwest, that French Canadians never really played an important role that far west. And so I tracked them through the fur trade in particular, which was the only outsider economy in the whole Pacific Northwest until the 1840s. Before that time, it was an indigenous place. And what happens is that the fur trade is there, and the fur trade exists, run by the Hudson's Bay Company out of London, because it's basic, and the fur trade and the workforce on which it relies is young men who've come from Quebec for employment. And not only have they come from Quebec for employment, but at the end of their first 2 or 3 year contract, they decide to stay. And what happens is that they decide to stay because they become attached and they partner with Indigenous women. And so you have a company based in London, which is at the time in the beginning of the 1840s, when you had Americans starting to come into the Pacific Northwest over the Oregon Trail. And the United States decided they wanted to have the whole area extending from what was then Spanish California, which would soon become an American possession, north through Alaska, which was then Russian, but would soon become an American possession as well. And nobody cared. The British government didn't care. This was a time when there was no interest in colonies between an earlier colonial time period and a later colonial time period. And it was only the Hudson's Bay Company, which had connections in London, which intervened to say, no, we want to keep the northern part because we're making a profit. And they're making a profit because of French Canadians and the Indigenous women and the kind of family life that they had created. And therefore they had this stable workforce. So that's the argument of the book. A lot of books I've done have been about women. I went to write about men, about French Canadians, different kind of history, but I discovered I could not write about French Canadians unless I wrote about the Indigenous women from across the Pacific Northwest. Because except for their presence and except for the kinds of relationships which developed, none of this would have taken place. And I think the testimony to the strength of the relationships, which is important to keep in mind, is that when it became possible in 1839, for the first time, the first Catholic priests came for men to be married if they wanted. It was literally a lineup to get married because they had long relationships, or some of them had short relationships, depending upon when they arrived. But these are relationships they wanted to solidify within the Catholic Church. I think that's also, really revealing part of this kind of the story. I think it's very important that all Canadians engage in their entire history. One of the lessons, or the lessons I took away from doing this research and writing this book, is that we as Canadians are disparate and separate and of many backgrounds in many, many different ways. But the one that we tend to forget about, apart from French Canadians as French Canadians being certainly part of Métis people on the prairies, but we don't remember that, in fact, the French Canadian presence is really integrated into who we are as Canadians, in the sense of we were the French Canadians. The settlement was so much earlier than it was elsewhere. It was elsewhere in what we think of as Canada today, that the French Canadian presence is, among us. It's hidden from view, but it's among us in very real ways, across Canada, and not just in the prairies, as we've been willing to accept, but also in the Pacific Northwest. And that was, I think, that was one of the strongest lessons I took away from this, once this book was done, which I wrote in a sense to satisfy myself, as academics tend to do, but when people, recognize and acknowledge what has been happening. And I think we still haven't acknowledged the kinds of threads which bring Canada together as a nation. And I think that this French-Canadian presence across the country is one of the threads that really, sews us together as a country. It's been an amazing feeling to know that this book has won this very important prize. And it won 2 prizes within British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest previously. You don't write as academics. You don't write books so that real people are going to read them. And what you discovered is, when I discovered that real people read the book and actually were affected by it and changed by it, this is the most phenomenal thing that can happen to any of us who are scholars or who write.